My wife has always had a complicated relationship with her parents. The usual stuff you see in these kinds of stories: lack of respect for boundaries, constant unsolicited opinions on every aspect of her life, a general sense that because they brought her into the world, they get to dictate how she lives in it. Her parents are the kind of people who believe that their involvement in her upbringing, especially their financial contributions to her long and expensive education, entitle them to an indefinite say in her choices. The problem is, my wife is a natural people pleaser. She struggles to push back against them, not because she agrees with them, but because standing up to them fills her with guilt. I, on the other hand, have absolutely no problem setting boundaries with elders. I left home at 16, paid my way through life, and became pretty successful by the time I was 30. I am perfectly comfortable saying no without feeling any kind of emotional turmoil about it. This has always made the dynamic between me and my in-laws very different from the one they have with my wife. They do not try to boss me around because they know it would not work. Instead, they focus all their energy on her, and she finds it incredibly difficult to resist. A few years ago, when our 2 kids were still very young, we made a major move, far from her parents, far from the constant intrusion, far from the emotional roller coaster that came with their proximity. And honestly, the distance helped. It did not fix things entirely, of course, but it added a layer of insulation that made interactions much more manageable. They could not just drop by unannounced anymore. They could not pressure her into last-minute plans. They could not insert themselves into every detail of our lives. They split their time between my wife's hometown in California, and we saw them a few times a year, which was plenty. But then, my mother-in-law retired. And suddenly, they started making noises about moving closer to us. At first, it was just talk. Idle speculation. Wouldn't it be nice if we lived near you? Musings that we did not take too seriously. My wife would vent about it privately, saying she hoped it was just another one of their passing ideas. She loves them, but she also knows exactly what living near them would mean: constant visits, constant input, no more buffer between her and their expectations. She was finally starting to enjoy the autonomy she had never had as an adult, and the idea of losing that was enough to make her stomach twist. For a while, I thought this was just one of those things they would talk about and then forget. They had done it before. Big, sweeping statements about changing their lives that never amounted to anything. But then a house 2 doors down from us went on the market. Now, we live in a fairly secluded neighborhood. There are not a lot of houses, and turnover is low. It is the kind of place where if something goes up for sale, it does not happen often, and when it does, people notice. And my in-laws noticed. They called my wife, barely containing their excitement. They told her they were putting in a bid. They were thrilled by the idea of being our neighbors, of being able to see the grandkids every day, of being a part of our lives in a way that was not possible with the current distance. My wife's face fell as she listened to them. She was trying so hard to keep her voice even, to sound supportive, but the panic was all over her. She got off the phone and told me what was happening. She was upset, but she also felt helpless. She kept repeating that there was nothing she could do, that it was their decision, their money, their right to live wherever they wanted. But I could see how much it was weighing on her. She did not want them here. She was terrified of what it would mean for our family dynamic. She knew she would never be able to say no to them if they were right next door. I asked her what she wanted. She hesitated. She would not say the words directly, but I knew her well enough to understand. She did not want them getting that house. But she also could not bring herself to actively do anything to stop them. That was when I decided to step in. I did not argue. I did not try to convince her to take action. I simply made up my mind. I formed an LLC and put in a bid at full asking price. I could afford it. I knew my in-laws, and I knew how they operated. They had this sense of entitlement about real estate, just like they did about everything else. They assumed that because they wanted the house, they would get it. They put in a lowball offer full of conditions, fully expecting that the seller would work with them. But I was not playing that game. I came in with a clean offer, no contingencies, full asking price. The seller took it immediately. And just like that, the house was mine. I did not tell my wife. Not because I wanted to keep secrets from her, but because I did not want to put her in a position where she would have to lie to her parents or, worse, admit the truth and deal with the fallout. This way, she could play innocent. She could shake her head and say, "I have no idea what happened." It protected her from the inevitable explosion. And oh, did they explode. They raged. They were furious at the mystery person who had outbid them. They were convinced there was some conspiracy at play. They accused the seller of being shady, the real estate agent of screwing them over, the whole system of being unfair. They could not believe that they had lost. My wife listened to them vent, nodded sympathetically, made all the right noises of understanding. And the whole time, I kept my mouth shut. Only one person knew what I had done, my brother. And when I told him, he called me an asshole. He said it was a manipulative move, that I had taken away their agency, that I had overstepped in a major way. That genuinely surprised me. From my perspective, I had done exactly what needed to be done. I had protected my wife's mental health. I had prevented a situation that would have made her miserable. I had ensured that our family could continue living the life we had built without interference. I do not regret it. I rented the house out to a family who really needed it, and I left the management to an agency so I would not have to think about it. It was a win-win. But my brother's reaction made me wonder. Was I actually in the wrong? Did I overstep? Or did I just do what my wife could not do for herself? Update 1. Thanks for all the helpful comments. A few things that need to be clarified. First, I do not think my brother is going to spill the beans. He has not seen my in-laws in years, and he is not exactly the type to reach out and get involved in family drama that does not directly concern him. His objection is more philosophical. He believes that, in the long run, it would be better for me and my wife to deal with her parents directly rather than relying on tactics like this. In his mind, my actions were just a way to sidestep the inevitable confrontation, rather than facing it head-on. I see his point, but I also know my wife. If there was a way for her to have a hard conversation with her parents and enforce boundaries without immense guilt eating her alive, she would have done it already. Second, the house is not just sitting empty. The agency I hired has strict instructions to rent only to permanent residents. The last thing I want is to have it sitting unoccupied for months at a time, or worse, ending up in the hands of short-term renters cycling in and out. That would only draw more attention to it and make it an obvious point of interest for my in-laws. With a long-term tenant in place, it just becomes another occupied house in the neighborhood. There is nothing particularly remarkable about it, nothing to spark their curiosity. My in-laws, for all their faults, do not like renting. They like things to be tailored exactly to their requirements, in the way that only ownership allows. The idea of them renting from an agency where they would have to follow someone else's rules. Not happening. And finally, for those wondering, my wife and I have mostly separate finances. I made most of my money before we met, and while we share things that impact both of us, our investments remain largely separate. This was purchased with my own resources. My wife has little interest in our investments, and honestly, she has always preferred to leave those kinds of decisions to me. That being said, a lot of the comments here made me realize that at some point, I need to tell her. I have been avoiding that moment, partly because I do not want to put her in an uncomfortable position, and partly because, if I am being completely honest, I am not sure how she will react. I know she did not want them living next door, but knowing something has been handled and knowing exactly how it was handled are two different things. So I start thinking about the best way to tell her. It is not a conversation I want to drop on her out of nowhere. It needs to be at the right time, when she is in the right frame of mind, when the kids are not running around needing attention, when she has the mental space to process it. And most of all, it needs to be framed correctly. If I just dump it on her like, by the way, I bought the house next door to keep your parents from moving in, she is going to panic. She is going to feel cornered, like she is suddenly part of a conspiracy she never signed up for. And that is the last thing I want. So I wait. And in the meantime, life moves on. My in-laws are still talking about the mystery buyer, but it is clear their anger is starting to fade into resignation. They lost. They are unhappy about it, but there is nothing they can do. The house is gone, and they need to start looking elsewhere if they are serious about moving closer. My wife, while outwardly sympathetic, is clearly relieved. I can see it in the way she does not bring it up unless they do. In the way she does not seem nearly as anxious as she was when they first announced their bid. She is sleeping better. She is more relaxed. Update 2. Well, it finally happened. I told my wife. I had been waiting for the right moment, but as it turns out, there is no such thing. The conversation just happened. We were sitting on the couch one night, the kids were asleep, and she casually mentioned that her parents had started looking at houses in another neighborhood about 15 minutes away. She said it like it was nothing, like an afterthought. But I could hear the hesitation in her voice, that undercurrent of anxiety she always got when talking about them making big moves. I nodded, acting neutral, but inside, I knew this was my last chance. If they found a house in that neighborhood, we were back to square one. Well, they wouldn't be right next door, but 15 minutes away was close enough for them to still feel like they had unlimited access. Close enough for them to stop by unannounced, to help with the kids whenever they felt like it, to slowly erode the boundaries my wife had just started to establish. I took a deep breath. Looked at her. Said, before they get too serious about moving, there's something you need to know. She turned to me, eyebrows slightly furrowed. What? And that was it. The moment I had been dreading. I told her everything. I started from the beginning, the house listing, the phone call where her parents had been so excited, the way her face had fallen when she realized what it would mean. How I had seen that look, knew what she wanted but also knew she would never say it out loud. I explained how I had stepped in, how I had formed the LLC and put in the bid before her parents had a chance to play their usual games. I told her how I had paid full asking price, no contingencies, making sure the seller would take my offer over theirs. How I had done all of it without telling her, not to deceive her, but to protect her. To give her an out. I watched her expression shift as I spoke. First, confusion. Then shock. Then something else, something I couldn't quite name. She did not say anything for a long time. She just sat there, absorbing it all. I could almost see the gears turning in her head, processing what I had done, what it meant. Finally, she let out a sharp breath and said, I don't know whether to thank you or be mad at you. Fair enough. She asked why I had kept it from her, why I had not let her be part of the decision. And I told her the truth, because she would never have made the decision. Because she would have let them move in next door, not because she wanted them there, but because she would not have been able to bring herself to stop them. Because she would have chosen their happiness over her own. She ran a hand through her hair, exhaled again. So what do we do now? And I told her, nothing. Her parents had already resigned themselves to losing the house. They were still talking about the mystery buyer, but their frustration had dulled into resignation. As long as we did not stir things up, they would move on. She nodded, quiet, thoughtful. Then she surprised me. She said, I need some time to think about this. I had expected more relief. More gratitude, even. But she was still processing. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over yet. Update 3. She told them. I am still trying to wrap my head around it. She promised she wouldn't, said she needed time to process, but I should have known. It was eating her alive. The guilt, the secrecy, it was too much. So she told them everything. It didn't go well. They lost it. Full nuclear meltdown. Accused me of manipulating her, of controlling our marriage, of stealing their future from them. Her father called me a snake in a suit, as if my success made me inherently untrustworthy, as if my ability to plan and execute meant I was scheming against them all along. Her mother was crying, saying she couldn't believe her own daughter would let this happen, that she had never felt so betrayed in her life. They were devastated. Furious. But underneath all of it, I could tell, they were hurt. They genuinely believed we had betrayed them. My wife tried to explain. Tried to make them understand why she didn't want them living next door. That it wasn't about them personally, but about her needing space, about her finally feeling like she had a life of her own after years of feeling like she had to answer to them. That she loved them, but she knew if they lived 2 doors down, she would never be able to maintain boundaries, never be able to say no without guilt clawing at her from the inside out. They didn't want to hear it. They told her that if she had a problem with them moving closer, she should have just told them. That they would have respected her wishes. That they never would have forced their way in if they knew she felt that way. Which is ironic, because if that were true, none of this would have been necessary in the first place. If they truly listened, she wouldn't have spent her whole life walking on eggshells around them, feeling like her decisions needed to be justified, feeling like her autonomy was something she had to fight for. After an hour of back and forth, her father said something that hit harder than I expected. He said, "You didn't even give us a chance." And for the first time, I saw hesitation in my wife's face. Because in a way, he was right. We had assumed the worst. We had made decisions based on who they had been, not on who they might have been. We had operated under the belief that they would never respect a boundary unless it was forced upon them, that they would have made our lives unbearable if we had simply told them no. And maybe that was true. Maybe, if she had said from the beginning that she didn't want them moving in next door, they would have ignored her feelings and bought the house anyway. But there was also the possibility that they wouldn't have. That, as much as they had a history of steamrolling over her boundaries, they might have relented if they knew how much it mattered to her. It didn't change the outcome. It didn't undo anything. But it planted something in her mind, something that would linger far longer than their initial anger. They left angry. Said they needed time to think. That was 3 days ago. We haven't heard from them since. I do not regret what I did. I still believe it was the right call. But I also know that, no matter how justified it was, this choice came at a cost. My wife is struggling with that now. I can see it in the way she keeps checking her phone, waiting for a message that doesn't come. I can see it in the way she stares off into space when she thinks I'm not looking, lost in thought, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. She knows we made the right choice, but she is also grappling with the knowledge that it came at a price she didn't anticipate. The distance she always wanted is finally here, but not in the way she imagined. Instead of an unspoken boundary, there is now a fracture in the relationship, one that may or may not heal. And the thing is, I don't know where we go from here. Maybe they will cool off. Maybe they won't. Maybe this will be the thing that finally forces a real reckoning in their relationship, the moment when my wife realizes she has spent her entire life trying to please people who never considered whether she was happy in return. Or maybe this is just another cycle, another round of emotional upheaval before things settle into a new version of the same old pattern. She hasn't talked about it much since that night. I know she's still sorting through her emotions, still trying to figure out what this means for her relationship with them, for the dynamic she thought she had with them. And I'm giving her the space to do that. But there is one thing I know for certain. No matter what happens next, no matter how this plays out, I would do it all over again. Because for the first time, she isn't living in fear of their reactions. For the first time, she made a choice for herself, even if it was difficult. And no matter how much she struggles with the aftermath, she is learning something important, that she does not have to sacrifice her peace for the sake of keeping others comfortable. And that is worth everything. Update 4. It's been 2 months since everything blew up. And if you had asked me back then how I thought this would end, I would have said one of two things: either her parents would eventually cool off and things would return to a strained but functional normal, or this would be the final breaking point that permanently changed their relationship. Turns out, I was wrong on both counts. For the first few weeks after my wife told them the truth, there was complete radio silence. No calls. No texts. Nothing. My wife tried reaching out twice, once to check in, once to invite them to a video call with the kids, but both times, she was met with cold, one-word responses. It was clear they were still furious. She spent a lot of that time second-guessing everything, wondering if she had made a mistake. She never said it outright, but I could see it in the way she'd linger by her phone, waiting for a message that never came. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, they called. My wife's mother, sounding chipper, said they were finally moving forward and had just put an offer on a house. My wife, cautiously hopeful, asked where. I saw her face drain of color as she listened. They bought a house 6 minutes away. Not next door. Not 2 doors down. But 6 minutes away, just far enough that they could say they weren't intruding, just close enough that they could still drop by whenever they wanted. My wife looked at me as she repeated what her mother had said: "Isn't this great? Now we can be close without being too close." I knew what this was. This wasn't reconciliation. This wasn't compromise. This was a power move. They were making it clear, you don't get to push us away. My wife was caught off guard. She stammered something vague about how she hadn't expected this, but before she could fully process, her mom was already going on about the new house. They had already planned their first visit. They were already talking about helping with the kids, about spontaneous family dinners, about how this was so much better than the house they originally wanted. It was like they had completely rewritten reality in their minds. They had decided that the problem wasn't their overwhelming presence, it was just logistics. My wife hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. Finally, she muttered, I don't know if I should be relieved or terrified. I told her the truth, this wasn't over. And I was right. At first, things seemed manageable. They were polite. Surface-level friendly. They would text before visiting. They'd ask before making plans. It felt like they were trying, like they wanted to prove they could be respectful. My wife was cautiously optimistic, thinking maybe, just maybe, this would work. And then the slow push started. It was subtle at first. A casual, we were in the neighborhood, so we thought we'd stop by. A surprise lunch visit because we figured you'd be home. Requests to babysit that weren't really requests, just assumptions that they'd be taking the kids. The first time my wife said no, her mother got visibly upset but covered it up with a strained, oh, okay, if that's what you really want. The second time she said no, her father asked, is this because of him? And that was when I knew. They hadn't changed. They had just adapted their strategy. The final straw came last weekend. My wife and I were getting ready to take the kids out when her parents showed up at our front door. No warning, no text, just showed up. They had food with them, acting like it was the most normal thing in the world. My wife, flustered, told them we already had plans. Her mother laughed like it was a joke, saying, oh, come on, plans can change. Her dad chimed in, you see your friends all the time. But we're your parents. And that was it. That was the moment. My wife, my people-pleasing, conflict-avoiding wife, snapped. I have never seen her speak to them like that before. She didn't raise her voice, but her tone was firm, clear, and final. She told them that this, right here, was the problem. The assumption that they could override her plans, her choices, her life. She told them that if they really wanted to be part of her life, they needed to respect her boundaries, not just pretend to. Her mother's face went pale. Her father's jaw clenched. I could see the shock on their faces, like they genuinely did not expect this from her. And then her dad made the mistake of saying, well, we wouldn't have to do this if you didn't let him poison you against us. I saw the exact moment my wife stopped feeling guilty. She didn't get angry. She just closed off. She looked at them for a long second and then quietly said, I think you should go. And for the first time in her entire life, she didn't backtrack. She didn't soften the blow. She didn't try to make them feel better about it. They left in stunned silence. That was a week ago. We haven't heard from them since. For the first time in years, my wife isn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for their next move. She isn't checking her phone, dreading their texts. She isn't making excuses for them. She finally understands.